Hey, what's up, all? It's Topics, and just wanted to make this fun, hopefully under 10-minute video on the War Within Season 1 dungeons. Going to be ranking these based on two criteria. Number one is going to be how fun they are. So that includes, replayability. Do I get excited when I get this key? Hopping into this dungeon, am I pumped? Or am I, irritated to see this key because it's not very fun? It's frustrating to play. It's one of those keys that you don't want. If you re-roll your key, you really hate to get that key. So that's one of the ways I'm going to be grading this. Another one is I'm going to be grading this based off of high key difficulty and enjoyability. So, 12 plus maybe. How is the design? Is it a good design? Was the dungeon well made? I know some of these are old and were brought back, so did they revamp the dungeon properly? So basically fun and design are the two ways that I'm ranking this. So tier 1 is one of the best dungeons of all time. The next tier is very good dungeon, happy to see it return. So if they brought back any of these dungeons again, that'd be fine. Mid-tier dungeon is, it wasn't good, it wasn't bad. I don't really want to see this dungeon again, but, if they did, it wouldn't be a big deal because it's just kind of meh. This next tier is there's lots of issues. This dungeon's frustrating to play, probably a dungeon that I don't want to see again. And, I hope that my dungeon doesn't re-roll into this key. And then the worst one would just be, delete this. I never want to see it again. It's probably one of the worst dungeons I've ever seen. So let's get going here so I can keep this video under 10 minutes. So number 1 is Ara-Kara. So I'm going to talk about each dungeon for maybe 30 seconds and then rank it. So Ara-Kara I would put in the tier of people want to see their key roll into this, right? This is a weekly key. A lot of people want to do their 10s on this. It's fast. It's one of the notorious 2-chest dungeons. Can't really think of anything too frustrating in this dungeon. Maybe the trash in between first and second boss can be a little irritating with their chain casts. On high keys, you really need to have some coordination there and assign kicks. The requirements in this dungeon aren't too big. You don't really need any CCs. You don't really need skips. You just need 2 poison dispels probably. That's about it. All in all, I wouldn't put this as one of the best dungeons of all time. It's very linear. There are some routing differences you can do in this dungeon, but for the most part, I've only really seen maybe 2 or 3 routes. There isn't anything about this dungeon that gets me in particularly excited. So I'm going to put this as a very good dungeon. I would be happy to see it return maybe in a future season. I think that's a respectable tier. Next is City of Threads. So this isn't one of the, I wouldn't say this is the hardest dungeon this season. It's definitely not one of the easier ones. I think most people would rank this maybe 5th or 6th difficulty, with maybe only a couple dungeons harder than it. I do think this dungeon design is cool. Some people are indifferent about the roleplay in the middle. I do think it's a little bit long. I don't mind roleplay if it's, 30 seconds, maybe a minute, but when you have this section in the middle of the dungeon where you have this 5-minute long roleplay, it's kind of weird. I think that they need to take that stuff out of Mythic Plus dungeons and just leave them in maybe normal, heroic, and Mythic 0, and just remove that roleplay from Mythic Plus. The boss design in this dungeon is pretty good. I know a lot of people get excited about the last bosses. If you're a healer, maybe not so much, but I know as a tank that I play, the last 2 bosses are pretty fun to tank. The trash in here is pretty good. The trash after the second boss where you can do a huge pull. I know that the DPS probably like that. They know that they have a giant pull coming after the second boss. But I do know this isn't one of the keys that you're, particularly excited about getting this season. So I'll probably put this in the middle. It's a mid-tier dungeon. It wasn't super good, but it also wasn't bad. Next, we'll talk about the Dawnbreaker. So this is probably a polarizing and controversial dungeon. I know that there's one group of people who would probably put this way up there. Some people probably would put this at the bottom. I think the biggest frustration about this dungeon is that it can be buggy. I know that the airships can bug out on a lot of people. People have fallen through them. I've even seen a case with me where they didn't even spawn. We did the second pull on the first ship, and then we went to fly over to the other ships, and they weren't even spawned for me. So I was flying around the dungeon looking for these ships, and they weren't even there. So I don't think I can put this as one of the best dungeons of all time just because of those bugs. I think it was one of the first times they put it, probably the second time ever they put a dungeon where you could freely fly around since dragon riding came into place. Noku Defensive was the first one. This is probably the second time they put a dungeon you could freely fly around. So it's definitely good for routing. There's a lot of different routes in here, people pulling different trash packs in different orders. I think people are a fan of 3 boss dungeons because they're short. So, this was another notorious 2-chest dungeon. I think you're overall pretty happy to see your key roll into this dungeon. As a tank, this is fun. I think as a DPS, this dungeon's pretty fun. Maybe healers have a tough time with the second boss. I think this dungeon is definitely a little bit better than mid-tier. I'm probably going to put it behind Ara-Kara in the very good dungeon. Happy to see it return. I think if they do bring this Dawnbreaker dungeon back, though, they should definitely take a look at the airships and some of the bugs with that. And potentially how long you have to wait for the last boss to land. I think it's a little bit long. They need to shorten that. So let's move on to the last War Within dungeon, which is Stonevault. People would probably consider this, either tied for the hardest key, maybe the hardest or second hardest. I don't think people are too mad if they see their key roll into this because a lot of people need this key. They have a hard time finding it because a lot of groups, if they get a Stonevault, they'll just re-roll it into something else. So I think this is a key that a lot of people need to time. It's a modernized dungeon, it's polished. You can really see Blizzard's design of only pulling 1 pack at a time in here. There's not too many giant pulls in here, just due to the amount of casts, the curse debuffs going out. And just the difficulty on the tank. Tanks trying to do huge pulls in here is extremely dangerous. You obviously have the first pull that's big. That's probably one of the only pulls that you can do that big. And then there's maybe 1 to 2 other pulls in the dungeon that you're going to pull 2 packs or more. But for the most part, it's pretty linear. You do 1 wing, you clear it. You do another wing, you clear it. The only decision making you really have in here is which wing you're going to do first. And maybe if you're going to meld or invis skip the guards on the last wing before the final boss. So Skarmarak is a pug killer in here. That boss is very badly designed in my opinion. It's not intuitive at all at the start of the season how you were supposed to do that boss. How many shards do you kill? What do the shards even do? What are these little crystals that you get for a buff? I think a lot of people weren't sure. The Master Machinist boss has also gotten nerfed and bug fixed a lot. So based on the amount of changes this dungeon received and the amount of design flaws I see with it, I can't put this as a good dungeon. I think I'm going to have to put this dungeon in lots of issues, frustrating to play, and hope to not see it again. I can't see too many people hoping to see this dungeon come back. And I just don't see people too happy when their key rolls into this. It's a tough key. You need a lot of coordination, and if this is a regular tier list, this would be like C tier, right? So C or D tier. All right, so now we're on to the revamped dungeons. I'm probably not going to spend as much time on these. This video is getting kind of long. Grim Batol. Probably people would agree this is the hardest key this season. It's got the lowest success rate, and it's typically your lowest key timed, especially in high key groups and rank 1 pushers. Lot of casts. You can't pull too big in here. The dungeon's just extremely W key. Right, there's not any different paths you can take. You just literally have to go from the start to the end. The only decision making you maybe have is when you press Lust, and maybe adding 1 or 2 mobs to a pack. But it doesn't really change your pull size. It just changes what mobs you're pulling into that. Like if you have a flame bender or flame render or whatever they're called, do you pull that in with this pack? Do you not pull it in? Stuff like that. Do you clear the second boss area before you pull the boss or after? But all in all, there's not a whole lot you can do with this dungeon. I don't think it's one of the worst dungeons of all time. You know, they brought this dungeon back. Yeah, when I think of one of the worst dungeons of all time, I'm trying to think of what it would even be in that category. Because you know that's subjective, right? Depending on what you think is one of the worst dungeons of all time. But then again, you know, can I think of many dungeons worse than this? I don't know if I can. I also don't want this to be a tier list of everything in the middle. I'm probably going to put this all the way at the bottom, to be honest. I don't think anyone wants to ever see this again. I don't think anybody wanted it in this season, the way that they released it. There's nothing really good to say about this dungeon, right? Like, is there any part of this dungeon that you love, that they absolutely nailed? I don't really think so. I think we have to put this at the bottom. This, in terms of modern Mythic Plus, I think this is probably one of the worst dungeons that we've ever seen in a dungeon pool. You know, I'm sure there's a couple that are right beside it or maybe below it, but I do think this belongs in the bottom tier. I think I'm gonna do Siege of Boralus next, and then we'll do the two Shadowland seasons or dungeons. Siege of Boralus. People were probably more upset about this dungeon coming back than they were about Grim Batol, because Grim Batol was never in a dungeon pool ever, right? Siege of Boralus was. Siege of Boralus was a BFA dungeon. The biggest pug killer in this dungeon are the skips. The way that this dungeon is designed, the trash count and where the mobs are placed, you end up skipping after second pull through the doorway there, the arches before first boss, and then you also end up skipping the sniper packs or some type of pack at the end. So it's a dungeon with a required skip. Having to skip in dungeons isn't a bad thing, but when the skips are mandatory, which these feel like, it becomes a problem. The last boss is problematic in many ways for healers, for DPS. On high keys, it ends up being like almost a 6-minute long boss fight, which is ridiculous. So, although I don't think this is one of the worst dungeons all time in a Mythic Plus pool that we've seen, I definitely think it has lots of issues, is frustrating, and people don't really hope to see this come back again. The funny thing is it ended up being one of the easier dungeons if you could execute it this season. Maybe third or fourth easiest, but yeah, it definitely doesn't belong any higher than this. I probably would put it behind Stonevault, because I think Stonevault has more potential than Siege of Boralus does. They just can't really do anything else with Siege of Boralus. It is what it is. All right, now we have the two Shadowlands dungeons left. We're gonna do Mists first. So Mists was one of the more liked and popular dungeons in Shadowlands. I think Mists and Halls of Atonement were the two fast dungeons, right? They both were pretty quick, 30-minute dungeons. You enjoyed it if your key turned into a Mist or a Halls of Atonement in Shadowlands. Now, bringing Mists back, I think that people were a little bit irritated that they didn't change the maze. You know, you still need this weak aura or add-on to help you solve the maze. It takes time. Once you're in the maze, the only thing you can do is wall pull, right? You can't choose which way you're going. The game decides for you, and there's certain areas you can wall pull and you can't. Sometimes the wall pull would bug and like snap to a DPS and insta-kill them. Sometimes the wall pull wouldn't work. It's just very buggy. I think they should have changed the way the maze worked. Other than that, there's not too many casts to worry about in here. Nothing super dangerous, but I don't think there's anything about this dungeon that got you excited other than it was one of the easier dungeons and you wanted your key to turn into it. So I don't know if I'd put it in very good. Happy to see it return. You know, we're already getting this back for a second time. I don't think people want to see it again. But I would put it mid-tier. I'd probably put it above City of Threads, though. I think people probably would prefer Mists over City of Threads for fun and design. But I think you could debate City of Threads being better than Mists, potentially. But yeah, I think it's mid-tier. Belongs about there. All right, last one, Necrotic Wake. So I think that a lot of the same things I said about Mists, probably you could apply to Necrotic Wake. This is probably one of the more enjoyable dungeons in Shadowlands, maybe behind Mists and Halls of Atonement. I think potentially was Necrotic Wake. I think the problem in modern Mythic Plus, though, is having to use weapons that you pick up around the dungeon is a form of RP, adds complexity to the dungeon, and can change the way that you do the dungeon a lot. But in modern Mythic Plus, there's like one right way of doing things, right? Like, you know, you're going to spear specific bosses, you know you're going to use your orb and shield at specific times. So it wasn't really an additional layer of flexibility in the dungeon. It was really just another mandatory task you had to do. And I really hate the flesh crafter tech in this dungeon, where you just CC the flesh crafter and use it to kill bosses. It feels really out of place. All in all, I don't think people are excited to get Necrotic Wake. It's probably one of the hardest pug dungeons this season, especially when you add in the second boss. Having to kick the boss, having to kick in the mages. You need a DK to grip in the mage, or maybe you CC a mage, and that second boss killed a lot of pugs. It's probably one of the worst pug dungeons this season, either worst or second worst. I don't think people want to see this come back again. I don't think this dungeon had a lot of bugs. There wasn't anything that really needed to get patched specifically. It was more just frustrating in pugs to play. So I'm not sure if this is mid-tier. But you know what? I don't think people want to see this again. I don't think it belongs in the same category as Mists or City of Threads. So I'm probably going to put it above Stonevault. In the lots of issues, frustrating to play, hope to not see it again. It didn't really have issues, but it definitely is frustrating to play, and I don't think people want to see this again. So this is my tier list. If I took away the wording on the side, it would be, 2 dungeons in A tier, 2 in B, 3 in C or D, and 1 in F. I think I've heard a lot of creators and high Mythic Plus players also agree with potentially how I categorize this. This wasn't one of the better Mythic Plus seasons in terms of dungeon pool or design. I really only hope to ever see 2 of these back, and that'd probably be Ara-Kara and Dawnbreaker. I wouldn't mind seeing those back in a future season. But leave a comment below. Tell me what you guys think about this tier list. I know I tried to make this a 10-minute video, but proved to be a little bit harder than I thought. So if you're still here, thanks for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe, and stay tuned for more Prot Warrior and WoW content. Thanks.